The warehouse was silent except for the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the darkness. Bumpy Johnson stood in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the entrance where his oldest friend would walk through any moment. The same friend who had shared meals at his table. The same friend who had sworn loyalty with blood. The same friend who had just sold him out to the Luciano family for 30 pieces of silver. The trap was set, but not the way anyone expected. To understand what happened that night in 1948, you need to go back 3 weeks earlier, to when Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem like an untouchable king. While other crime bosses relied on violence and fear, Bumpy built his empire on something far more dangerous: intelligence. He knew every secret, every weakness, every move before his enemies even thought to make it. That's what made him legendary. That's what kept him alive. But even legends have blind spots, and Bumpy's blind spot had a name: Marcus Sugar Williams. Sugar had been there from the beginning. When Bumpy was nothing but a hungry kid with big dreams and bigger fists, Sugar was the one who watched his back. When the cops tried to pin murders on Bumpy that he didn't commit, Sugar was the one who provided the alibis. When rival gangs tried to move in on their territory, Sugar was the one who stood shoulder to shoulder with Bumpy in those dark alleys, ready to die for the brotherhood they'd built. 20 years of loyalty, 20 years of trust, 20 years of sharing everything from profits to secrets to women. Sugar wasn't just Bumpy's right-hand man. He was family. He was blood without being born from the same mother. That's why nobody saw the betrayal coming. The Luciano family had been trying to muscle into Harlem for months. Lucky Luciano himself had put out the word. Whoever could deliver Bumpy Johnson's head would earn a seat at the commission table and control over all of Manhattan's drug trade. The bounty was worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. But Bumpy had survived every attempt, every scheme, every trap they'd set for him. He was too smart, too careful, too protected by the loyalty of his crew. Or so he thought. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday night at the Cotton Club. Bumpy was conducting business in the back room when one of his lookouts burst in, face white with panic. "Boss, we got a problem. The feds just raided 3 of our numbers joints simultaneously." They knew exactly where to look. They had detailed maps of our operations. Bumpy didn't flinch. He never flinched. But behind those cold, calculating eyes, his mind was already racing. Simultaneous raids meant inside information. Detailed maps meant someone with access to his inner circle had talked. Someone he trusted. Someone close enough to know the locations that only 5 people in his entire organization knew about. Sugar was one of those 5 people. That night, Bumpy began watching his oldest friend, not with suspicion at first, but with the careful attention of a man who had survived 2 decades in a game where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. He noticed small things. How Sugar's hands shook slightly when counting money from the numbers game. How Sugar avoided eye contact during their weekly strategy meetings. How Sugar kept checking his watch like he was expecting something. Or someone. The second sign came a week later. One of Bumpy's most trusted distributors, a man named Jerome who had worked the same corner for 8 years without incident, was found in the Hudson River with 2 bullets in his head. The word on the street was that Jerome had been skimming money. But Bumpy knew Jerome. The man was loyal to a fault and honest as the day was long. Someone had fed the Luciano family false information about Jerome to test their inside source. Someone had sacrificed a good man to verify that their betrayer was real and reliable. Bumpy's blood ran cold when he realized the only person who could have given the Luciano family information about Jerome was Sugar. But even then, even with the evidence mounting like storm clouds before a hurricane, Bumpy didn't want to believe it. This was Marcus Williams, the same man who had pulled him out of that burning building on 125th Street when they were teenagers. The same man who had loaned him his last $100 to buy his first shipment of policy wheels. The same man who had cried actual tears when Bumpy's mother died. How do you reconcile 20 years of brotherhood with the possibility that it was all a lie? Bumpy decided to test his theory. He called Sugar into his office and told him about a fictional meeting with a new supplier from Detroit. He said they would be exchanging $200,000 for a shipment of premium heroin at Pier 47 the following Friday night. He made Sugar promise to keep the information confidential. "You know I got your back, Bump," Sugar had said, clasping his friend's hand. "Always have. Always will." Friday night, Bumpy watched from a distance as federal agents and Luciano soldiers surrounded Pier 47, waiting for a drug deal that would never happen. That's when Bumpy Johnson's heart turned to ice. The betrayal wasn't just about money or power. It was about something deeper, something that cut through the very foundation of everything Bumpy believed about loyalty and brotherhood. Sugar hadn't just sold him out to the enemy. He had taken 20 years of genuine love and friendship and turned it into a weapon. But here's what the Luciano family didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson. Here's what even Sugar, after all those years, had failed to recognize. Bumpy didn't just survive by being smart. He survived by being 3 moves ahead of everyone else, including his enemies, including his friends. As Sugar's footsteps grew closer to the warehouse entrance, Bumpy smiled in the darkness. The trap was indeed set. But the prey wasn't who anyone expected it to be. Because sometimes the only way to catch a snake is to let it think it's caught you first. The next morning, Sugar Williams walked into Bumpy's office like he owned the place. He had that swagger that comes from believing you're untouchable, that confidence that comes from thinking you've outsmarted the smartest man in Harlem. He poured himself a drink from Bumpy's private bottle of bourbon and sat down across from his oldest friend with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard there was some trouble at Pier 47 last night," Sugar said, taking a slow sip. "Lucky you decided not to go through with that Detroit deal." Bumpy watched his friend's face carefully. 20 years of reading people had taught him that the truth always lived in the details. The way Sugar's left eye twitched when he lied. The way he touched his nose when he was nervous. The way he overcompensated with false concern when he was guilty as sin. All the tells were there. "Yeah," Bumpy replied, his voice steady as granite. "Real lucky." What Sugar didn't know was that Bumpy had spent the entire night planning his next move. Not a move of violence, that would be too easy, too expected. The Luciano family expected Bumpy to come at them with guns blazing. They expected the legendary temper that had made him famous in the streets. They were prepared for war, but they weren't prepared for chess. That afternoon, word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson was finished. The feds had him dead to rights on the pier operation, and lucky Luciano's soldiers were moving into his territory like vultures circling a dying animal. The numbers runners were scared. The policy wheel operators were looking for new bosses. Even Bumpy's most loyal soldiers were starting to whisper about jumping ship. Sugar played his part perfectly. He called emergency meetings with Bumpy's lieutenants talking about damage control and strategic retreats. He suggested they close down operations for a few weeks until the heat died down. He even offered to reach out to some contacts who might be able to help them weather the storm. "We got to be smart about this, Bump," Sugar said during one of these meetings. "Maybe it's time to consider Lucky's offer. He's been trying to buy us out for months. Better to take the deal than end up in the ground." The other men in the room nodded. It made sense, it was practical, it was survival. But Bumpy Johnson had never built his empire by playing it safe. "You know what I think, Sugar?" Bumpy said, leaning back in his chair. "I think Lucky Luciano made a mistake when he decided to come for me. And I think whoever's been feeding him information made an even bigger mistake." The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Sugar's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the glass of bourbon suspended in midair. "What you trying to say, Bump?" "I'm saying somebody in my organization has been talking to people they shouldn't be talking to. Somebody close to me. Somebody I trusted." Bumpy's eyes swept the room, stopping on each face before moving to the next. Somebody who knew about operations that only my inner circle knew about. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every man there was thinking the same thing. It could be any one of them. It could be the man sitting next to them. It could be their best friend, it could be themselves. "You got proof of that?" Sugar asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Not yet," Bumpy replied. "But I will." That night, Sugar made his second mistake. He thought Bumpy was bluffing. He thought his oldest friend was just paranoid, striking out blindly because he felt cornered. So he did what guilty men always do when they think they're about to be caught. He tried to finish the job. The meeting was set for midnight at the old Lenox Avenue warehouse. Sugar told Bumpy that one of his contacts had information about who the real traitor was. He said the man would only meet in person, only meet with Bumpy himself, and only meet in private. "He's scared, Bump," Sugar explained. "Says if the wrong people find out he talked, he's a dead man, but he's willing to give up the rat for the right price." Bumpy agreed to the meeting. Of course he did, because by then, he knew exactly what game was being played. What Sugar didn't know was that Bumpy had already reached out to his own contacts, real contacts, people who had been watching the Luciano family's movements for weeks, people who had been documenting every meeting, every phone call, every exchange of money, people who had photographs of Sugar Williams shaking hands with Lucky Luciano's lieutenant in a coffee shop on the Upper East Side, people who had recordings of Sugar's voice giving detailed information about Bumpy's operations to federal agents who were on the Luciano payroll, people who had evidence that would not only destroy Sugar Williams, but bring down half of Lucky Luciano's organization in the process. As Bumpy walked toward the warehouse that night, he thought about friendship. He thought about loyalty. He thought about the man he had trusted with his life for 20 years, and how that man had chosen 30 pieces of silver over 2 decades of brotherhood. But mostly, he thought about justice. Because in Bumpy Johnson's world, betrayal wasn't just a crime against business. It was a crime against the very fabric of what made a man worth trusting. And crimes like that demanded a punishment that would be remembered long after the guilty party was gone. The warehouse door was slightly ajar when Bumpy arrived. He could see shadows moving inside, hear whispered voices planning his execution. Sugar was in there along with at least 3 other men who weren't part of Bumpy's crew. Men who carried themselves like soldiers. Men who killed for money instead of principle. Men who had no idea they were walking into their own funeral. Bumpy checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, Sugar Williams would learn that some friendships run deeper than betrayal, and some men are too smart to be trapped by their own trust. The game was about to begin, and Bumpy Johnson had already won. Because the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies. It's letting them destroy themselves while thinking they're destroying you. But first, Sugar had to walk through that door and face the man he thought he had outsmarted. The man who had been waiting for this moment since the day he discovered the truth about his oldest friend's loyalty. Bumpy Johnson walked through that warehouse door like he owned the place, like he owned the night itself. His footsteps echoed through the darkness with the confidence of a man who had never lost a game that mattered. Behind him, the door clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Sugar Williams stood in the center of the warehouse, flanked by 3 men Bumpy had never seen before. Professional killers by the look of them. The kind of men who did wet work for the 5 families and slept like babies afterward. Their suits were expensive, their shoes were polished, and their eyes were dead. "Bump," Sugar said, stepping forward with that same false smile he'd been wearing for weeks. "Thanks for coming. I know this ain't easy, meeting like this." "Nothing about this business is easy," Bumpy replied, his voice carrying through the warehouse like a judge pronouncing sentence. "But some things are necessary." What Sugar didn't know was that Bumpy had spent the last 72 hours orchestrating the most elaborate trap in the history of Harlem street politics. While Sugar thought he was playing checkers, Bumpy had been setting up a chess match that would end with checkmate. 3 days earlier, Bumpy had made a phone call to Detective Raymond Mitchell. Mitchell was one of the few honest cops left in the NYPD, a man who had been trying to build a case against the Luciano family for months without success. The kind of cop who still believed in justice instead of payoffs. "Ray," Bumpy had said during that phone call, "what would you say if I told you I could deliver Lucky Luciano's entire Harlem operation to you on a silver platter?" "I'd say you must want something pretty important in return," Mitchell had replied. "Justice," Bumpy had said, "pure and simple." The deal was elegant in its simplicity. Bumpy would wear a wire to his meeting with Sugar. He would get his oldest friend to confess to the betrayal, to admit his connection to the Luciano family, and to reveal the names of every corrupt federal agent on Lucky's payroll. In exchange, Mitchell would make sure that when the dust settled, the right people went to prison and the right people walked free. But the wire was just the beginning of Bumpy's strategy. While Sugar had been busy planning Bumpy's execution, Bumpy had been busy planning Sugar's complete destruction. Not just his death. That would be too quick, too merciful. Sugar had betrayed 20 years of brotherhood for money. He deserved something worse than death. He deserved to live with the consequences of his choices. That's where Delilah Washington came into the picture. Delilah was Sugar's wife, a beautiful woman who had married him believing she was getting a man of honor and integrity. She had no idea that her husband had been living a double life for months, taking money from the same people who were trying to destroy the man who had lifted them both out of poverty. Bumpy had shown Delilah the photographs. Pictures of Sugar meeting with Lucky Luciano's lieutenant. Pictures of Sugar counting federal money in a downtown hotel room. Pictures of Sugar laughing and drinking with the enemies of everything her husband had claimed to stand for. "I'm sorry you had to see this," Bumpy had told her, watching as 20 years of marriage crumbled in her eyes. "But you deserve to know the truth about the man you married." Delilah had cried. Then she had gotten angry. Then she had gotten even. "What do you need me to do?" she had asked. Now, as Bumpy faced his oldest friend in that warehouse, he knew that Delilah was already at the bank, emptying every account Sugar had access to. She was already at their apartment, packing everything of value into suitcases. She was already on her way to the train station, carrying with her not just Sugar's money, but also copies of every document that could connect him to the Luciano family. Sugar Williams was about to lose everything that mattered to him: his money, his wife, his reputation, his freedom, and he didn't even know it yet. "So," Sugar said, glancing at his hired killers with confidence, "let's talk about this rat problem you've been having." "Yeah," Bumpy replied, his hand moving slowly toward his jacket. "Let's talk about rats." The three gunmen tensed, ready to draw their weapons at the first sign of trouble. But Bumpy wasn't reaching for a gun. He was reaching for something much more dangerous than bullets. Evidence. "You know what I learned about rats, Sugar?" Bumpy asked, pulling out a manila envelope thick with photographs and documents. "They always leave trails, and if you follow those trails long enough, they lead you right back to the nest." Sugar's face went pale in the dim warehouse light. "What you got there, Bump?" "Proof," Bumpy said simply. "Proof that some friendships ain't worth the paper they're written on." The wire taped to Bumpy's chest was recording every word. Detective Mitchell and his team were positioned outside the warehouse, waiting for the signal. Delilah was already 3 states away with enough evidence to destroy the Luciano family's entire Harlem operation. But none of that mattered as much as the look on Sugar Williams's face when he realized he had been outplayed by the man he thought he had outsmarted. "You see," Bumpy continued, his voice steady as a metronome, "when a man decides to betray his brother for money, he better make sure he's got enough money to buy his way out of the consequences." Sugar's hand moved toward his gun, but one of his hired killers grabbed his wrist. The professional understood something Sugar didn't. They were already caught. The only question now was whether they would make things worse for themselves by adding murder to their list of charges. "How long you been knowing?" Sugar asked, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Long enough to prepare for this moment," Bumpy replied. "Long enough to make sure you get exactly what you deserve." That's when Sugar Williams heard the sirens in the distance, growing closer with every heartbeat. That's when he realized the trap wasn't for Bumpy Johnson. The trap was for him, and he had walked right into it, led by his own greed and his fatal mistake of underestimating the intelligence of the man who had survived 20 years in a game where being smart was the only thing that kept you breathing. The warehouse doors burst open, and federal agents poured in like a flood of justice that had been 20 years in the making. But the real justice was yet to come. The federal agents had their guns drawn, but Bumpy Johnson raised his hand slowly, signaling them to wait. This wasn't their show anymore. This was between 2 men who had shared 20 years of brotherhood, and one of them was about to learn what betrayal really cost. Sugar Williams stood frozen in the center of the warehouse, his face a mask of disbelief and growing terror. The hired killers around him had already dropped their weapons and raised their hands. They were professionals. They knew when a job had gone sideways beyond recovery. But Sugar wasn't a professional. He was just a man who had made the worst mistake of his life. "You wore a wire," Sugar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You wore a wire to meet your oldest friend." "No," Bumpy replied, his eyes cold as winter in Harlem. "I wore a wire to meet a stranger, because the man I called my friend died the day he decided to sell me out for Luciano money." That's when Bumpy pulled out the photographs. Picture after picture of Sugar meeting with federal agents, shaking hands with Luciano lieutenants, counting stacks of blood money in hotel rooms across Manhattan. Each photograph was a nail in the coffin of their friendship, proof that the last 20 years had meant nothing to the man Bumpy had trusted with his life. "You want to know the beautiful part about all this?" Bumpy asked, walking closer to his former friend. "While you were busy planning my funeral, I was busy planning your complete destruction." Sugar's hands started shaking. "What you talking about, Bump?" "I'm talking about your wife, Sugar, sweet Delilah. You remember her, right? The woman who married a man she thought had honor?" Bumpy's smile was colder than a morgue at midnight. "She knows everything now. Every dirty dollar you took, every secret you sold, every lie you told her about working late when you were really meeting with my enemies." The color drained from Sugar's face like water from a broken sink. "You didn't. Tell me you didn't involve Delilah in this." "I didn't involve her," Bumpy said. "You did. The moment you decided to betray everything she believed about the man she married. The moment you decided to spit on 20 years of friendship for 30 pieces of silver. But the real twist was yet to come." Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out a bank statement. Sugar's bank statement. The one that should have shown the comfortable savings of a successful numbers runner. Instead, it showed a balance of $0.00. "Delilah cleaned out every account you had access to before she caught that train to Chicago," Bumpy explained, watching as understanding dawned in Sugar's eyes like a sunrise over hell. "But don't worry, she left you something." He handed Sugar an envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Sugar's wife boarding a train, carrying 2 suitcases and a folder thick with documents. On the back of the photograph, in Delilah's handwriting, were 4 words that cut deeper than any bullet ever could. 20 years meant nothing. "She's already given copies of your financial records to the FBI," Bumpy continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "Bank records showing every payment you received from the Luciano family, hotel receipts from your meetings with federal agents, even recordings of phone conversations where you sold out your own crew." Sugar stumbled backward like he'd been shot. "She wouldn't. Delilah wouldn't do that to me." "She would, and she did, because when a woman finds out that the man she loved was living a lie, she doesn't just get mad, she gets even." That's when Detective Mitchell stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "Marcus Williams, you're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, and providing material support to organized crime. You have the right to remain silent." But Sugar wasn't listening to his rights. He was staring at Bumpy with the look of a man who had just realized he'd been outplayed in every possible way. "You planned all this," Sugar whispered. "From the beginning. You knew I was the rat, and you set this whole thing up." "I hoped I was wrong," Bumpy replied, and for the first time that night, his voice carried a hint of genuine sadness. "For 20 years I hoped I was wrong about what kind of man you really were, but hoping doesn't change facts. And the fact is, you chose money over loyalty. You chose strangers over family. You chose betrayal over brotherhood." As the federal agents led Sugar Williams away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time. "What happens now, Bump? What happens to everything we built together?" Bumpy Johnson looked at his former friend with eyes that had seen too much betrayal and not enough justice. "What we built together died the day you decided to destroy it. What happens now is that I rebuild it stronger, smarter, and without snakes in my inner circle." The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting as the federal agents drove away with their prisoners. Within hours, the arrests would begin. Corrupt federal agents, Luciano family soldiers, everyone who had been stupid enough to trust a rat who was stupid enough to trust a king. But as Bumpy walked out of that warehouse, he wasn't thinking about victory. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the price of trust and the value of loyalty in a world where both were rare as diamonds and twice as precious. Sugar Williams had learned that some friendships run deeper than betrayal, but more importantly, he had learned that some men are too smart to be destroyed by their own trust. The game was over, and Bumpy Johnson had won it in a way that would be remembered long after everyone involved was dust. If you think Sugar Williams got exactly what he deserved for betraying 20 years of brotherhood, hit that like button, because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't violence. Sometimes it's just letting a traitor live with the consequences of his choices. But the story wasn't over yet, because what happened to Sugar Williams in prison would become a legend all its own. 3 months later, Sugar Williams was found dead in his federal prison cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide. A bedsheet noose, a man who couldn't live with the weight of his own betrayal. But the guards who found him told a different story in whispered conversations. They talked about how Sugar had been receiving letters every day, letters with no return address, letters that made him cry like a broken man, letters that contained photographs of his wife Delilah living her new life in Chicago, happy and free, surrounded by people who didn't know she had once been married to a rat. The last letter had contained just 4 words. 20 years meant nothing. Sugar Williams had learned the hardest lesson a man can learn. When you betray the people who love you, you don't just lose them, you lose yourself. But this story isn't really about Sugar Williams. This story is about Bumpy Johnson, and how a man builds an empire that can survive any betrayal, any trap, any enemy who thinks they're smart enough to outplay a king. Within 6 months of Sugar's arrest, Bumpy had rebuilt his organization stronger than ever. The federal agents who had been on Lucky Luciano's payroll were serving prison sentences. The Luciano family's entire Harlem operation had collapsed like a house of cards, and Bumpy Johnson sat on his throne more untouchable than he had ever been before. He never spoke Sugar Williams's name again. Not once. Not ever. When his new lieutenants asked about the empty chair in his inner circle, Bumpy would simply say, "Some chairs are better left empty than filled with snakes." But the real lesson of this story goes deeper than revenge or justice or even loyalty. The real lesson is about the price of trust in a world where trust is the most dangerous luxury a man can afford. Bumpy Johnson understood something that Sugar Williams never learned. Loyalty isn't about what people say when times are good. Loyalty is about what people do when times are bad. And when the chips are down, when the pressure is on, when someone offers you enough money to betray everything you've ever claimed to believe in, that's when you discover what kind of man you really are. Sugar Williams discovered he was the kind of man who would sell out 20 years of brotherhood for a briefcase full of federal money, and that discovery destroyed him more completely than any bullet ever could. The streets of Harlem still remember this story. Old-timers still tell it in barbershops and on street corners, passing it down to young men who think they understand the game but haven't learned its most important rule yet. Your word is your bond, and your loyalty is your life. They tell the story of how Bumpy Johnson turned his oldest friend's betrayal into his greatest victory, how he used Sugar Williams's own greed as a weapon against the enemies who thought they had found his weakness, how he proved that some men are too smart to be destroyed by their own trust. Today, when young hustlers talk about building crews and choosing allies, the old heads always give them the same advice. Remember Sugar Williams. Remember what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Remember what happens when you betray a king. Because this story isn't just about what happened in 1948 in a warehouse in Harlem. This story is about what happens every day, in every city, in every situation where people have to choose between loyalty and money, between honor and convenience, between being the kind of person who keeps their word and being the kind of person who sells it to the highest bidder. Bumpy Johnson lived by a code that most people today have forgotten. Your reputation is the only thing you truly own, and once you sell it, you can never buy it back. Sugar Williams learned that lesson too late, but his story serves as a warning to anyone who thinks they're smart enough to play both sides of the game. In the end, the game always collects what you owe. And betrayal is a debt that compounds interest until it destroys everything you ever cared about. The warehouse where this story ended is gone now, torn down decades ago to make room for progress. But the lessons learned in that warehouse echo through time, reminding us that some victories are worth more than money, some friendships are worth more than convenience, and some men are worth more than the enemies who try to destroy them. When people ask what made Bumpy Johnson a legend, they usually focus on his intelligence, his strategic mind, his ability to stay 3 moves ahead of his enemies. But the real answer is simpler than that. Bumpy Johnson became a legend because he understood that in a world full of Sugar Williams, being a man of genuine honor and loyalty isn't just rare, it's revolutionary, and that's a lesson worth remembering long after the last witness to this story has joined Sugar Williams in whatever place betrayers go when their time runs out. If this story taught you something about loyalty, about trust, about what it really means to keep your word in a world that profits from broken promises, then you understand why Bumpy Johnson's name is still spoken with respect, while Sugar Williams is just a cautionary tale told to children who need to learn the difference between friends and enemies. Because sometimes the difference is harder to see than you think, until it's too late.